I remember the way their eyes shifted when they looked at me, no longer filled with love or belonging, but with something colder, something that cut deeper than words ever could. Poverty was not just a condition I lived through, it became a label pressed onto my skin, an invisible stain that my own family could no longer tolerate. They spoke about me in whispers at first, the kind of whispers that pretended to hide, but were meant to be heard, the kind that sliced through the heart because they carried more judgment than concern. They said I was a burden, a shame, a reminder of everything they wished to escape. In their world, wealth was not just comfort, it was identity, and since I had none, I was treated as if I had no identity at all. The pain of rejection is not always loud. Sometimes it is a silence so sharp it makes you want to scream. I would sit at the table with them, listening to the clatter of plates and the rustle of conversation, yet I was invisible, my words falling flat before they ever reached their ears. There was no affection in the way they spoke to me anymore, only a calculated distance that made it clear I no longer belonged. My poverty was not seen as a struggle to overcome, but as a curse they wanted to cut themselves away from, as though disowning me could erase the shame they felt in the eyes of society. I was left to carry the weight of their disappointment on my shoulders, as though being born into less was a crime I had willingly committed. Every glance became a judgment, every sigh a condemnation. I began to feel as though my very existence was an inconvenience, that my presence in the family was an embarrassment they could no longer afford. They mocked my dreams, not with laughter but with disbelief, as though it was ridiculous for someone like me to imagine a future different from the present I was trapped in. What hurt the most was not the lack of money, it was the lack of love. I could have endured the hunger, the patched clothes, the sleepless nights, if only I had felt the warmth of belonging. Instead, I was made to feel like an outsider in my own home, a guest who had overstayed her welcome. They treated me like a shadow that followed them unwillingly, something they could not completely get rid of until the day they made their decision clear. The decision to disown me was not announced with fury, but with cold, deliberate words, the kind that were rehearsed long before they were spoken. I still remember the moment. The room was filled with the stale air of disappointment, and their faces were stiff with resolve. They did not shout, they did not cry, they simply said I was no longer a part of their world. It was a sentence delivered like a business transaction, without hesitation, without remorse. I tried to understand, I tried to plead with them silently through the tears in my eyes, but they had already turned away. Their backs told me everything I needed to know. My family had chosen wealth, appearances, and pride over me. The rejection burned deeper because it was not strangers who cast me aside, it was the people whose love was supposed to be unconditional. Strangers could have judged my clothes, my empty pockets, my weary hands, but I would have survived it. Yet when the ones who raised me decided I was unworthy, it was as if the ground beneath me gave way. I was left with nothing to hold on to, no anchor to keep me steady. The pain was not just emotional, it was physical, pressing down on my chest until breathing itself felt like a betrayal of my shattered heart. In those days, I replayed their words endlessly in my mind. Each syllable struck like a whip, reminding me that in their eyes, I was less than enough. I tried to imagine what I could have done differently, how I could have proven my worth, but no matter which way I turned the memory, the truth remained T. The world outside did not make it any easier. People sense rejection, they smell it on you like a bitter perfume that lingers. I was no longer introduced as part of them, no longer invited to gatherings, no longer acknowledged in conversations. It was as though I had died, and they were relieved to bury me in silence. When people asked about me, my family responded with half-truths and evasions, painting me as someone unworthy of notice. Their rejection became a story that followed me everywhere, written not in words, but in the way others looked at me, with pity, with curiosity, with judgment. I felt stripped of everything: my home, my place, my identity. Nights became longer, lonelier, filled with the echo of questions I could not answer. Was I truly that unworthy? Did my lack of money define me so completely that even love could not survive it? I walked through the world carrying these questions like chains, each one heavier than the last. My tears became a language of their own, silent but unrelenting, carving paths down my cheeks until my skin grew used to the sting. But even as the pain consumed me, I could not let go of the memory of who I once was. A daughter, a sister, a member of something greater than myself. To be rejected by them was to be stripped of my history, as though everything I had shared with them no longer mattered. Birthdays, laughter, late-night talks, all erased in one swift act of rejection. That was the wound that cut deepest. Not that they left me behind, but that they pretended I had never belonged in the first place. The nights were always the hardest. When the world outside was quiet and the darkness settled in, my thoughts grew louder, pressing against me like an unshakable weight. Hunger had a way of gnawing at the body and the mind at the same time, a slow, relentless reminder that I had been left to fend for myself with nothing but scraps of hope. I would lie awake listening to the creak of the walls, the faint sounds of life beyond my small room, wondering if anyone else in the world could feel the kind of emptiness I carried. It was not just the emptiness of an empty stomach, but of an empty heart, stripped of the love and belonging that once shielded me from despair. Every morning, I forced myself to rise with a determination that came from somewhere I didn't even know existed. The mirror became my silent witness, reflecting back the tired eyes, the thinning frame, the face that looked older than the years it carried. I would practice smiles I never felt, trying to convince myself that I was not broken, that I could still find a way through the shadows. Yet behind every forced smile, there was the truth I could never hide. I was struggling, silently, painfully, invisibly. Food was a luxury, not a certainty. I learned to stretch a single piece of bread over 2 meals, to sip water slowly so the illusion of fullness might carry me through a few more hours. My body weakened, but my will fought back with quiet defiance. I told myself each night that I could survive another day, even when my hands trembled from exhaustion, even when my stomach twisted with hunger. There was a strange kind of discipline in poverty, the way it taught me to endure, to accept less, to find gratitude in scraps that others would have thrown away without a thought. The world moved on around me, indifferent to my struggles. Friends grew distant, some out of discomfort, others out of fear that my misfortune might somehow taint their lives. I stopped expecting help. The silence of unanswered calls and unopened doors became its own kind of answer. I walked streets with my head low, not because I was ashamed of who I was, but because the weight of judgment in other people's eyes was too heavy to bear. They did not know the battles I fought, yet they decided who I was with a single glance at my worn clothes and tired face. Loneliness became my constant companion. There were nights when I would curl into myself, hugging my knees as though holding my own body could replace the comfort of arms that were no longer there for me. Tears came often, sometimes without warning, sliding down my cheeks as I cooked whatever little I had or as I folded the same faded clothes over and over again. Yet, even in those tears, I stayed silent, because I had no one left to listen. My struggles were my own, invisible to the world, unspoken, because I had learned that speaking them only invited pity or judgment instead of compassion. I found myself seeking refuge in small things that others would overlook. The warmth of sunlight on my skin felt like a blessing, the scent of rain a reminder that beauty still existed in the world even when everything else felt bleak. I discovered strength in small victories, the days I managed to earn a little, the nights I went to bed without hunger, the mornings I woke up with just enough hope to rise again. These small fragments of survival stitched themselves together into something larger, something that kept me alive even when every part of me wanted to give in. Work was never easy to find, and when it came, it was rarely enough. Long hours, little pay, harsh words from people who saw me as nothing more than replaceable labor. I endured it all because survival demanded it. I wiped sweat from my brow and hid the blisters on my hands, swallowing the bitterness of humiliation because I could not afford to walk away. Every coin I earned felt like both a victory and a reminder of how far I had fallen. Still, I clutched those coins tightly, knowing they were my lifeline, knowing that even the smallest effort was proof that I had not yet given up. There were days when the struggle felt unbearable, when I would stand in the middle of a crowded street and feel like I was fading, like I was nothing more than a shadow moving among people who had forgotten I even existed. The noise of the world was deafening, yet I felt trapped in silence, unable to share the truth of my pain. To admit the depth of my struggle felt dangerous, as though exposing my wounds would only invite more cruelty. So I carried it inside, a storm that raged quietly behind tired eyes. Even in the quietest moments, the struggle followed me. At night, when I closed my eyes, memories of what I had lost haunted me. The laughter of family that once filled my ears was replaced by the echo of their rejection. The warmth of belonging was replaced by the chill of solitude. I tried to block it out, to convince myself that I no longer needed them, but the absence carved itself deeper every day. My struggles were not only about poverty, but about the void left behind when love was withdrawn. There were moments I questioned everything: my worth, my future, even my reason to keep moving forward. I wondered if my life would always be this endless cycle of hunger, rejection, and solitude. But each time despair threatened to consume me, something small pulled me back, a memory of who I once was, a fleeting vision of who I might still become. The struggles were silent, yes, but within them was a voice that refused to be silenced, a whisper that told me I was more than my pain, even if no one else could see it. Day after day, I carried my struggles like invisible weights strapped to my shoulders. They shaped the way I walked, the way I spoke, the way I saw the world. They humbled me, they scarred me, they tested me in ways I never thought I could endure. And though I was surrounded by silence, though no one came to ease the burden or dry the tears, I kept moving. Step by step, breath by breath, I learned to endure the unendurable. My silent struggles became the unseen battles that defined me, carving strength into my soul even as they broke me in ways no one else would ever understand. There comes a moment in every struggle when the weight of pain becomes too much to bear, and you find yourself standing at a crossroads with only two choices left: surrender to the darkness or fight for the light you can barely see. For me, that moment arrived quietly, without warning, in the midst of one of the loneliest nights of my life. I had grown accustomed to the ache of hunger and the sting of rejection, but that night it felt different, heavier, as though the silence itself was daring me to break. I sat in the small corner I called my room, staring at the cracked walls that had witnessed countless tears, and I realized that if I did not change something, I would drown in this despair forever. The turning point did not come wrapped in miracles or sudden opportunities. It came in the form of a decision, raw and desperate, carved out of the fragments of pain I had carried. I began to see my struggles differently. Each sleepless night, each harsh word, each empty plate became fuel, kindling a fire that had been smoldering quietly beneath my despair. The tears that once weakened me now sharpened my resolve. If my family could discard me so easily, then I owed it to myself to prove that I was more than the sum of my poverty. I did not need their approval, their acceptance, or their acknowledgement. What I needed was to rise in spite of them, to stand tall enough that even they could not look away. The first steps were the hardest. My body was tired, my spirit bruised, but I forced myself to move forward with whatever strength remained. I searched for opportunities with relentless determination, even when doors slammed in my face and strangers dismissed me without a second thought. I carried myself into places where I felt out of place, where my clothes marked me as less, where my voice trembled because I had forgotten what it felt like to be heard. But with each rejection, I grew harder, stronger, more unwilling to let despair claim me again. I took jobs no one else wanted, tasks that others considered beneath them. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, carried loads that bent my back, worked hours so long that sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Yet within that grind, I discovered something unexpected: the pride of survival, the dignity of earning even the smallest coin through my own effort. Each day I worked, each small wage I brought home, became a brick in the foundation I was determined to build. The turning point was not about sudden wealth or immediate success, it was about perspective. For the first time, I began to believe that my future was not chained to my past. I began to set goals, small at first, like saving enough to buy decent clothes or eating more than one proper meal a day. Those small goals, once achieved, ignited something inside me. If I could manage the small victories, perhaps I could reach for bigger. I started to educate myself, using whatever resources I could find. I borrowed books, I listened to conversations, I observed people carefully, picking up lessons from their words and their actions. Knowledge became my secret weapon, something no one could take from me. I spent long nights studying by dim light, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, but my mind hungry for growth. Every new thing I learned felt like a key, unlocking doors I once thought were sealed forever. Slowly, I noticed a change in myself. My voice grew steadier when I spoke, my eyes bolder when I looked at others, my back straighter when I walked. The timid girl who had once curled into herself to avoid the weight of judgment was fading, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had begun to believe in her own worth. The world had tried to convince me I was powerless, but within me I had discovered a resilience that no rejection could destroy. The turning point was not just about survival, it was about reclaiming my identity. For too long, I had allowed others to define me by what I lacked, but now I was determined to define myself by what I was capable of. I was no longer just the poor girl who had been abandoned. I was a fighter, a learner, a builder of my own destiny. Every struggle I had endured became part of the armor I now wore, protecting me from the doubts that once consumed me. I began to dream again, cautiously at first, then boldly. Dreams of creating something meaningful, of building not just wealth but a life I could be proud of. I imagined standing on my own 2 feet without fear, imagined walking into the same rooms where I had once been invisible and commanding attention not because of money, but because of strength. These dreams became the fuel that kept me moving, even when exhaustion tempted me to give up. What made this turning point so powerful was not that the pain disappeared, but that I finally understood how to use it. The rejection that had once shattered me became the very force that pushed me to rise. The hunger that had once weakened me became the reason I worked harder. The loneliness that had once suffocated me became the space where I built a new relationship with myself. Pain had been my prison, but now it was my fire. I stopped waiting for someone to save me and realized I had to save myself. I stopped mourning the love I had lost and began pouring that love into my own growth. I stopped looking back at the doors that had closed and started searching for the ones I could open. My past had been full of silence, but my future was beginning to hum with possibility. I no longer walked with the weight of being unwanted. I walked with the knowledge that I was capable of creating a life so full that the very people who rejected me would one day have no choice but to see me again. The climb was slow, uneven, and filled with obstacles that threatened to break me at every step, yet something inside me refused to let go of the momentum I had found. I carried with me the fire born from rejection, the hunger carved into my bones, and the stubborn will that would not allow me to remain in the same place where I had been abandoned. Rising was not just about moving forward, it was about lifting myself from the ashes of what had been destroyed, piece by piece, until I could see the reflection of someone stronger in the fragments of my shattered past. I began with nothing but determination, and it was that determination that drove me to work harder than anyone around me. When others grew tired, I kept going. When others complained about what they lacked, I focused on what I could create. The pain of my past was a constant reminder that going back was not an option, so I pushed forward with every ounce of strength I had. The long nights I once dreaded became opportunities, hours I filled with work, learning, and planning. Slowly, I began to see results, small at first, but undeniable, and each one felt like a step upward from the pit I had once been buried in. With each coin I earned, I learned the value of discipline. I no longer wasted anything. Every bit of money I brought in was saved, invested, or used to open new doors. While others spent without thought, I held on to my resources tightly, not out of fear but out of a growing vision. I was not just surviving anymore, I was building. Each decision I made was deliberate, fueled by the dream of a future where I would never again be at the mercy of anyone's rejection. Opportunities did not fall into my lap, I created them. I asked questions, I took risks, I accepted challenges that others walked away from. There were times I failed, times when the setbacks nearly dragged me back into despair, but I had learned that failure was not the end. Failure became a teacher, whispering lessons I could not have lear. The rise was not only external but internal. As my skills grew, so did my confidence. The timid girl who once shrank from the world began to stand taller, her voice stronger, her gaze unafraid. I learned to walk into rooms where I had once been dismissed and hold my ground, no longer begging for acceptance, but demanding respect through the force of my presence and the proof of my work. The same people who had once overlooked me began to take notice, not because I asked them to, but because I had made myself impossible to ignore. I surrounded myself with knowledge, hungry to absorb everything that could propel me forward. I read, I listened, I observed. I sought out mentors, not always in formal ways, but by watching how successful people moved, how they spoke, how they made decisions. I studied the world with careful eyes, taking what I needed and discarding what no longer served me. The world that had once seemed closed off began to open, revealing paths I had never imagined. And with each new skill I acquired, I felt myself climbing higher, my hands gripping tighter to the ladder I was determined to ascend. The sacrifices were countless. I gave up comfort, I gave up sleep, I gave up the fleeting pleasures that tempted me to stray from my path. There were moments when exhaustion pulled at me so fiercely I thought my body might collapse, but the vision of who I wanted to become pulled me through. I knew that rising meant leaving behind not only the past, but also the habits and fears that once defined me. I shed them one by one, even when it hurt, even when it left me feeling raw and exposed, because I knew that to climb higher, I had to become someone new. Soon, I began to see the fruits of my labor take shape in ways I had only dreamed of. The jobs grew better, the pay grew higher, the opportunities wider. People who once doubted me began to approach me with respect, offering partnerships, seeking my input. I was no longer just a survivor, I was becoming a creator, a leader, someone others looked to for guidance. The world that had once shut me out now had no choice but to open its doors, because I had built my own key. Yet what defined my rise most was not the money I began to earn, nor the recognition that started to come my way. It was the strength within me, the unshakable core that had been forged through years of struggle. I realized that wealth alone could not define me. What defined me was the journey that had shaped me into someone who could stand unbroken in the face of adversity. My scars were no longer signs of weakness, but marks of survival, proof that I had endured what many would not have survived. I worked not just for myself, but for the version of me who had once cried in silence, who had once felt invisible, who had once been discarded. Every achievement was a message to her, a reminder that she had been worth fighting for all along. The rise was for her, for the girl who had been told she was nothing, for the woman who refused to accept that lie. As I climbed higher, I never forgot where I had started. The memories of hunger, of loneliness, of rejection remained etched into me, but they no longer dragged me down. Instead, they became the fuel that kept me moving, the reminder that I could never allow myself to return to that place. They gave me perspective, grounding me even as I soared, reminding me that true strength is not found in wealth alone, but in the resilience that carries you there. The rise was not a straight path. There were moments when I faltered, when doubts crept back in, when the weight of it all threatened to pull me down. But each time, I remembered the promise I had made to myself in the darkest nights, that I would not be defined by rejection, that I would carve my own path no matter how impossible it seemed. And so I kept climbing, step by step, higher and higher, determined that nothing and no one would ever cast me aside again. The day came when my steps carried me back toward the world I had once been cast out of, though I was no longer the same fragile girl who had been rejected. The roads I walked were familiar, but the weight I carried was different now. Where once my pockets were empty, they now held the rewards of my labor. Where once my eyes were lowered in shame, they now met the horizon with unshakable confidence. The return was not planned as an act of vengeance at first. It was the inevitable crossing of paths when the life I had built finally rose high enough to collide with the one that had tried to bury me. Every memory of their rejection was still etched into me, but I no longer carried it as a wound. It was a scar, a reminder of what I had survived, and though the pain of it could still echo in certain moments, it no longer controlled me. Walking back into their world was like walking into the pages of a story I had long outgrown, yet the characters remained the same, clinging to their pride, their judgment, their shallow measures of worth. They had expected me to disap. The first encounter was almost surreal. Faces that had once looked at me with contempt now struggled to mask their disbelief. Their eyes darted over the clothes I wore, the way I carried myself, the quiet authority in my voice. They tried to reconcile the memory of the girl they had discarded with the woman standing before them, but the two images would never align. I could see it in their hesitation, the way their words faltered, the unease in their posture. They had prepared themselves for the version of me they thought I would always be, but they had not prepared for this. The house that once felt like a prison of rejection now looked smaller, stripped of the power it once held over me. I stepped through the doorway with steady feet, my heart pounding not with fear but with a strange calm. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken history, yet I did not waver. I had spent years preparing for this moment, though not in ways they could see. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every tear shed in silence had been leading to this return. It was not about showing them what I had gained, but about proving to myself that their rejection no longer defined me. Conversations began awkwardly, filled with questions that barely scratched the surface of the truth. They asked where I had been, what I had done, how I had managed to rise from the place they had left me in. Behind their words, I heard the disbelief, the discomfort, the quiet envy they tried to conceal. Some spoke with forced politeness, others with strained pride, pretending as though they had always believed in me, as though they had never abandoned me at all. But I remembered too well. I remembered the silence, the words that cut, the day they turned their backs. Their attempts to rewrite history only fueled the quiet fire within me. The return was not about anger, though. It was about reclaiming space that had once been denied to me. I sat at their table once again, the same table where I had once been invisible, and this time my voice carried weight. My presence could not be dismissed, my words could not be ignored. I did not need to raise my voice to be heard. My very being was proof enough of the journey I had taken. They listened not out of choice, but because the woman I had become demanded it. I noticed the small shifts in their behavior, the way their tone softened, the way their eyes lingered on me with something that almost resembled regret. But regret, I knew, was not enough to erase what had been done. They could not undo the years of abandonment, the nights I had suffered alone, the scars I bore from their rejection. What they offered now was not love but acknowledgement, a recognition of the strength I had forged without them. And though part of me still ached for the warmth of family, another part knew that I had outgrown the need for their acceptance. The return was also a confrontation with my past self. As I walked through the familiar streets, I saw shadows of the girl I used to be, the one who cried quietly in the corners, who begged silently to be seen, who carried shame like a second skin. I wished I could reach back and tell her that she was always worthy, that she would rise higher than the pain she was drowning in. The sight of those memories reminded me why I had fought so hard, why I could never allow myself to fall again. People in the community whispered as I passed, their voices tinged with surprise. They remembered me as the one who had been disowned, the one left with nothing. Now they looked at me with wide eyes, murmuring about the transformation, the success, the strength that radiated from me. Their whispers no longer wounded me, they validated the truth I already knew. I had become everything they once said I could never be. Even in moments of quiet, when I was alone after facing them, I reflected on how far I had come. The return was not only a moment of confrontation, but also of healing. To walk back into the space where I had been rejected and stand unbroken was the closure I had never realized I needed. I no longer felt the weight of proving myself to them. I had proven myself to me. I was no longer the girl desperate for their approval. I was the woman who had built a life so full that their rejection now seemed like a stepping stone rather than a wall. The return was not marked by triumphal announcements or grand gestures. It was quieter than that, more powerful in its silence. I walked through their world not with arrogance, but with certainty, carrying myself with the dignity they had once denied me. Every look, every word, every interaction reminded me that I had risen beyond their reach. They could no longer hurt me, no longer diminish me, no longer define me. I thought often of the girl I used to be, the one who had cried into the night, the one who had begged the victory did not arrive with fireworks or applause, nor did it need to. It came quietly, in the stillness of moments where I realized I no longer carried the chains of my past. Victory was not just measured in wealth, though the fortune I had built spoke loudly in a world that once dismissed me for being poor. It was measured in the freedom I now held, the independence that no one could strip away from me, the dignity that came from knowing I had crafted my life with my own hands. To stand in a place where once I had been humiliated and know that I was no longer the same powerless girl was its own form of triumph. Every success I achieved, every milestone I reached, was a brick in the foundation of my victory. There had been countless nights when exhaustion threatened to break me, when loneliness pressed so heavily against my chest that I wondered if I would ever make it through. But I endured, and each moment of persevere. The people who had once judged me now looked at me with eyes that could no longer deny the truth. Their whispers of scorn had turned into murmurs of admiration, though I knew that admiration born of wealth was shallow compared to the loyalty I had craved as a child. They marveled at the life I had built, at the power I wielded, at the confidence in my voice. Their envy was almost palpable, and in that envy, I saw the reversal of the balance of power. Once I had been the outcast, the one they dismissed without hesitation. Now I was the figure they could not ignore, the presence they had to acknowledge whether they liked it or not. Victory was not about flaunting what I had gained, but about standing tall in the truth of who I had become. I no longer sought their approval, no longer yearned for their validation. The freedom of not needing them was sweeter than any wealth I could ever acquire. I could look at their faces and feel nothing but the quiet strength of someone who had risen on her own terms. The victory was internal first, the voice inside me that no longer trembled, the heart that no longer felt unworthy, the spirit that no longer bowed in shame. There was a moment when I stood before them, the same people who had once turned me away, and I felt the weight of silence wrap around us. They wanted to speak, to rewrite history, to pretend they had always believed in me. But their silence was more powerful than their words. It was an acknowledgement of the truth they could not deny, that I had succeeded without them, that I had proven every doubt wrong, that I had survived everything they thought would destroy me. That silence was my victory, louder than any speech or declaration could ever be. Victory also lived in the smaller, quieter details of my life. It was in the home I owned, the walls that echoed with peace instead of rejection. It was in the meals I could afford, the freedom to choose without fear of scarcity. It was in the clothes I wore not to impress OT,